It's day 2 of Camp to You, and our theme today is community prayer. Today's scripture passage is from the book of Esther. This has been one of my favorite Bible stories ever since I was a little girl. I show this book to way too many people. It's a book that my mom gave my sister and I when we were little. But I found it particularly powerful as a young girl to read the story of a young woman who was empowered by prayer to save her people. The story of Esther is a narrative in the Hebrew Bible. It is the focal point today of the Jewish festival of Purim. It's still read in synagogues around the world during this festival and is a story of triumph and celebration. It's a pretty short story that tells a rather humorous and at times bawdy tale when read in the original Hebrew. It details the lives of Jews living in the Jewish diaspora during the 5th century BCE. What's a diaspora? A diaspora is a community of people living outside of their homeland. Most often, if you hear about the diaspora, it's probably in reference to the large Jewish diaspora living outside of Israel-Palestine still to this day. Esther's story is an account of a young woman who saved her people from complete destruction due to a plot from the king's advisor that was to annihilate Jews across Persia. Side note, I realized as I was rereading through the devos that I prepped for you all that I made a small error. Esther didn't live in Babylon, she lived in Susa. Both were under the control of the Persian Empire. About 100 years before Esther's story is set, Jerusalem fell under Babylonian control, and a number of deportations by the Babylonian Empire forced the exile of thousands of Judeans to Babylon. We'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. A few decades later, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and brought it into his empire. Jewish descendants from the original Babylonian exile, like Esther and her family, were still living across the empire. You may be thinking, Molly, why are you telling me this? First, it's never too late to see when you're wrong and correct yourself. Second, the history of exile and oppressive rule is something that has been carried by people of Jewish faith for millennia, over and over again, and is a recurring theme in this story. Learning the history behind it provides a greater context and understanding for those who read it. While we can't say with certainty that Esther's story is 100% historically factual, it still rings with a greater truth. For people who have experienced hardship, oppression, and violence, Esther's story is a statement of hope, particularly for communities removed from their homelands. It shows the power of community and faith when people come together. When we find Esther in today's scripture passage from chapter 4, she's at a crossroads. She's forced to come to terms with the fact that she is the only one with the ability to save her people. What a terrifying thought. When Esther became queen, she gained unparalleled power overnight. But in order to keep that power, she had to hide that she was Jewish. Her cousin Mordecai warned her that although she had new power and privilege in the palace, inevitably it would not save her. He tells her, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will come from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish." Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. So she gathers together with her community in prayer for 3 entire days, and prayer strengthens them. It gives Esther the courage to go to the king on behalf of her people, fully knowing that she could still die by revealing her identity while seeking justice for the Jewish community. She had to learn to use the privilege that she had for the sake of others. Privilege. That's a word that gets tossed around a lot these days. What do I mean by it? Privilege boiled down as having power, access to resources, and deeming something as normal or standard. Privilege often shows up as a mixture of these attributes and is something that everyone has to a degree. I don't find it especially helpful to compare privileges amongst people. Some people may assume that by having it, it's automatically negative, but privilege becomes negative when it is used to harm others or maintain an unjust status quo. Privilege is something that people have to work through today. It shows up in whiteness, in wealth, in Western Christianity, and heterosexuality. One of the worst parts may be the sense of normalization that it brings, that each of those things that I stated are normal or standard, and everything else that is different must be labeled so. So how do we work through it, and how do we use it for the uplifting of all people? Well, let's look at Esther. As a woman, she would not have had much power, particularly as someone who came from a faith and culture that was historically oppressed. But when she became queen, she gained far more power, influence, and access to resources than any of her people. She even assimilated herself into Persian culture, changing herself to fit into the Persian cultural norm by hiding her Jewish identity. Through all of this, she could have chosen to do nothing, but she knew that her position literally gave her the keys to life or death for her people. So she had to weigh which was more important to her. Her own life or the lives of her people? Esther chose her people. She used her privilege to lift up voices that were unheard so that they could defend themselves from violence. The crux of all of this was centered around prayer, a prayer for strength to do what is right, even when you're scared. This is the power of community prayer. I think as humans, we struggle when we're alone, but we find courage when we come together. Our faith is not just our individual relationships with God, because we're all interconnected. Since we're all made in the image of God, a harm against someone created in God's image is a harm against God. Clearly, in the story of Esther, Jewish life was not deemed sacred by leaders in Persia until a woman with power and privilege in elite society was put in danger. The king saw Esther in a vulnerable position, and that was the only way he could connect the dots to see that Jewish lives mattered. He saw, oh, Esther is this person I care about, and she's asking me to care about all of these other people like her. Maybe I should now. When I read through Esther, I see the absurdity in this line of thinking, but it's still prevalent today. For hundreds of years, particularly in the Christian tradition, Jewish life has not been honored. It has been oppressed and violated without much question until the early 20th century. And it still goes on today. Just 3 years ago when I was in seminary, I remember being told by the rabbi who taught my Hebrew language class that we might be forced to evacuate from our classroom at any time because bomb threats were being called in all across the United States to Jewish community centers. We were given a choice of what we wanted to do. We could stop taking classes at the JCC or stay. Our class chose to stay. When we gather together to pray alone or in community, I think we have to ask ourselves, who are we praying for? When I look around at my community, who do I see? Who are the people I care for, empathize with, and love? Do they all look like me? Do I only pray for people that I deem as valuable? Camp reminds me every day how much I need community. It is a place of hope and strength where people come together. And God transforms us in community. The image of God is expanded in every person that we meet. So when God calls us to action, like Esther was called, we're strengthened by our communities of faith who are praying for us. It's no surprise that so many movements that demand justice and to see the value of life have had faith as their undercurrent. The civil rights movement in the US was a faith movement. Women's suffrage and equality was a faith movement. Black Lives Matter is a faith movement. The calls for justice around the world right now are grounded in prayer, a prayer for strength and a prayer to witness. We are called to pray for strength and use our privilege like Esther, even when we're scared or unsure of ourselves, in order to witness to the sanctity of life and creation. Today's prayer practice is praying the hours. It involves setting time aside today to make prayer a priority. This practice resembles Esther's as she gathered her community together for 3 entire days of prayer and fasting. Now that might be a lot for you, so we've set the traditional hours of praying 6 times today. But if you can't make all 6 prayer times, try at least 3. That may seem like a lot of times to pray, but I believe the world over always benefits from our prayers. Who can you lift up in prayer today? Who around the world needs your prayers right now? Know that today and every day, you have the strength of your camp community holding you in prayer. Amen.